Here's a little mental rule of thumb when thinking about Jesus. If your mental picture of Jesus would never say or do anything controversial enough to get himself crucified, chances are you've replaced the real Jesus with cardboard cutout or caricature in your mind. That's what we're going to be taking a look at this time on Meeting Jesus. So all throughout our study of the Gospel according to Mark, we've consistently noticed how Jesus offers us a vision of God's reign and of his identity, his role that doesn't match up with people's expectations. From the people he associates with to Jesus doing and saying things that only God's able to do while also hanging around with all the disreputable people, to valuing the nobodies and sort of shrugging off the powerful or the respectable religious people. We've seen sort of the climax sort of building as Jesus has kind of said he's come to be like the messianic figure, the Messiah they've been waiting for, but not the way anybody has expected. Jesus has consistently said he hasn't come to be a new emperor, he hasn't come to start a violent revolution and overthrow the Romans or take back their country for God. This is not how God's agenda is accomplished, even though his disciples are sort of bent on, no, you're going to come in glory and, kill all your enemies and raise up an army. When we get to the 11th chapter of Mark's Gospel, there are two critical turning points, two sort of watershed moments that put the contrast between Jesus' way of doing things and the world's way of doing things in the sharp relief, and also becomes sort of that linchpin moment, that sort of final moment where the powers of the day are convinced we've got to get rid of Jesus. The first is the story that we call Palm Sunday, this day where Jesus enters into the city of Jerusalem and is greeted with people waving palm branches and shouting Hosanna, this sort of nationalistic sort of cry, save us, calling for Jesus to be the one to bring redemption. And again, most everybody in the crowd is picturing this is royal language, this is king language, right? We want a king to come and he'll overthrow the Romans, he'll set up his own government, his own kingdom, and finally we'll have things put right. And Jesus, even though he's allowed his disciples to use Messiah language about him, Jesus has always stopped short and said, but I'm not going to be what you're expecting. My way of accomplishing God's reign isn't conquering and killing. It's self-giving love that is willing even, to lay down my life on a Roman cross. It's to die for my enemies rather than to kill my enemies. This has constantly blown the disciples' minds. So even Jesus' entry into Jerusalem isn't Jesus saying, well, you know what, let's just do things the way empires do things. Let's have a triumphal parade. It's Jesus actually subverting, turning upside down the expectations of how the world works and how empires work. Just about everybody in Jesus' day would have been familiar with, every year around the Passover time, the Romans beefing up security, right? The way today, governments, when they anticipate there might be protests or when there might be unrest, will beef up the police or National Guard presence because they're wanting to quiet things down. They want to keep control over things. They don't want riots to break out, that kind of thing. And similarly, in the first century, every year at Passover, the Romans, once they were in power, would beef up security and sort of have this sort of parade of additional military presence. Picture, the Roman banners waving in the wind. Picture the gleaming metal of their armies and their weapons and their white war horses, that kind of thing, all as an effort to intimidate and to remind the conquered people who's really in charge. And Jesus takes that imagery that everybody would have seen. People would have been living through that the same week that Jesus does his entry into Jerusalem. And Jesus picks something intentionally subverting that, almost mocking the whole notion of the fancy military parade with all of its pomp and circumstance, and deliberately picks an image that echoes imagery from the scriptures, but also suggests lowliness and not needing to intimidate or impress. Jesus, the story says in Mark's gospel, borrows a donkey or a colt, right? A colt that's never been ridden. So picture a horse that ain't been broke yet, right? A horse that has been trained to have a human rider, a little diminutive horse or a donkey, depending on the translation or the storyteller. And Jesus borrows this and rides this into town. Now, donkeys and even untrained colts are not going to be the fastest animal. This is not going to be the majestic, powerful, this is like the slow, stubborn, meandering way into town. This is almost Jesus making fun of the whole notion of empires impressing and intimidating people with their shows of military force and power. Jesus rides in on the lowly animal, the donkey, and Jesus deliberately sort of pokes at the Romans in this moment. Now, the respectable religious people are all upset because they say, look, Jesus, you're going to rile people up, and we don't want the Romans to crack down. They are brutal, and they will kill, and they will silence, and they will beat people just to maintain order. They're afraid about what kind of Roman crackdown there will be. But Jesus' response is, again, he hasn't come to start a violent revolution. He certainly has come to expose all the pretender empires and powers of the world, while he points to the surprising, unexpected power of God's reign. So that moment, what we call the Palm Sunday parade, is actually loaded with sort of Jesus, the controversy, the final conflict between Jesus' way of bringing God's reign and Rome's way, the empire's way of accomplishing things. Rome only knows how to intimidate and bully and trumpet its own power, and Jesus comes not needing to advertise, not needing to impress, riding in on a donkey in order to demonstrate God's kind of servant rule, right? We just came through hearing Jesus say, if you want to be great in my way of doing things, in God's ordering of things, you put yourself in the position of lowliness. Jesus doesn't throw that away all of a sudden to ride into town on a Roman war horse. Jesus embodies what that kind of lowly leadership looks like, that servant leadership looks like, and he does it even on Palm Sunday. The next set of scenes is sort of a collective together. We get this interesting and very, very bizarre scene where Jesus goes out to the Mount of Olives and sees a fig tree, and even though it's not the season for figs, had been looking to see if there were any figs, and because he doesn't find any figs, curses it, and then heads on his way. And then he goes into the temple where he has seen the day before, at the end of the Palm Sunday story, he's seen that the temple is full of people making money off selling animals, and that there's money changing going on, that there's this sort of marketplace sort of atmosphere. Jesus sees all this and upsets all the tables, drives out the animals, and, quoting the words of the scriptures, talks about not making God's house a marketplace, and God's house shall instead be a house of prayer for all peoples. Jesus effectively shuts down the temple for that day. And then the next day goes back out past that fig tree, which by now has shriveled and died. This is one of those times where the way Mark tells the story is probably intentional, and Mark's trying to help us make connections. We've talked a couple of times before how Mark will do almost like a sandwich in his storytelling. There will be a sort of a outside bookend at the beginning and the end, and in the middle there'll be something that seems unrelated, but they all end up tied together, right? So there was the Jairus' daughter, she's sick, on the way to go help. There's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, and then Jesus comes back to the Jairus story at the end. There's been a number of other times where there's that sort of like part A, part B, and in the middle there's this filling of the sandwich, so to speak. And I want to suggest what goes on with the fig tree is meant to be interpreted alongside this business at the temple. That what Jesus has expected, what God has expected out of the temple is bearing good fruit, right? That this place that's supposed to be the meeting place for God and the people, this place of prayer for all nations, instead has become a commodity, has become like a transactional economic center, a place where even our relationship with God is commodified, and Jesus shuts it down, knowing that they're going to be able to open for business again tomorrow. But this is Jesus' sort of symbolic way of saying, no, I'm saying no to this. This is unacceptable. This is not what God intends this space to be. And that, in a way, much like Jesus had hoped for good fruit from the fig tree and doesn't find it, this is sort of Jesus' sentence of judgment on the temple to say, this temple isn't doing what it's meant to do anymore. This place has now become a box you try and contain God in. And that's not what I've come for, and that's not what God's intention has been. Later, Christianity would eventually have to say that we didn't need a single physical building or temple building to meet God, and that Jesus had become that meeting place between God and humanity. And so when the temple finally was destroyed by the Romans in the year AD 70, Christians dealt with that by saying, well, we don't need a single location. After all, we're scattering throughout the whole empire. We don't all have to come back to the Jerusalem temple. Jesus can be with us wherever we go. This story is sort of that turning point of Jesus sort of saying, yeah, this building that was meant to be a meeting place between God and humanity isn't doing what it's meant to be. And once again, human beings have tried to turn God into a commodity for sale. We're done with that. Jesus ends that in that symbolic sort of protest against the temple as well. But by the end of these two scenes, the Palm Sunday triumphal entry that sort of makes a mockery of the empire, and Jesus shutting things down in the temple, Jesus has now made really powerful enemies, both on the political side, the Roman Empire, and the religious leadership side, the people who run the temple. They are now all actively looking to get rid of Jesus, and both of the things Jesus has done could reasonably be described as disturbing the peace or upsetting order or something close to treason or sedition. So there are charges brewing that Jesus is going to have to be gotten rid of because he's pointing to another order, another way of doing things, another kingdom. And once Rome hears kingdom language, it gets antsy, it gets angry, and it looks to get rid of people who it sees as a threat. And once the people who run the temple see somebody saying, God doesn't live in this box, that becomes a threat to their way of doing things too. You've got both the empire, the political powers, the religious powers who run the temple looking to get rid of Jesus because Jesus has said and done things that threaten their ordering of things, because he's bringing a new order, what he keeps calling the reign of God, that isn't tied to anybody's empire or government, and also isn't contained inside a God box or a temple. Those stories help frame everything else that happens in the story that we call Holy Week. And in a sense, they really sort of are the culmination of everything Jesus has been saying and doing to this point in Mark's gospel. So this is a pretty important turning point as we head into the last week of Jesus' life as Mark tells it. We hope that you'll continue to join us, whether in person for our 1 o'clock Bible studies, walking through Mark's gospel like this, or catching up with these video summary sessions too. Either way, we hope you can join us here on future sessions of Meeting Jesus.